Okay. All right. So this is the afternoon section with the interview with Ad Foolen. He's a professor of Nijmegen University in the Netherlands. He's a linguist and he is a specialist in cognitive linguistics. And in the last years of his career, he's been devoting much of his research time to the study of language and emotion, or emotion in language. And this is going to form part also of a MOOC that we are designing, as part of the objectives that we have set for our research project. And so we're very happy to have Ad Foolen with us here in Madrid. Thank you very much for having come, for sharing this time with us, and it's really a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, and it is an honor to be interviewed over lunch. I told two people sitting next to me being interviewed, and it will be in English, as I've understood.
Yes.
And I also told you that English is my, not my native language, and I didn't study English. I will use my school English, so I apologize for my English in advance.
Okay, there's nothing to apologize about. Your English is perfect. I mean, we can understand perfectly well what you say. So we're interested in you now. We want to know something about your area of research, what your impressions, what has been the main thing about studying emotions in your life and why, etc. So I'm going to start with the first question I prepared, because of course I'm not a journalist, so I had to prepare my thing in order to more or less remember what I wanted to ask you. So why did you decide to study and do research about the expression of emotion in the first place? That is, what was your motivation for doing research in this area?
Yeah, it happened in the mid-90s at an international cognitive linguistics conference where Antonio Damasio gave a plenary lecture. It was in Albuquerque, 1995, and his lecture was based on his book that was published in 1994, Descartes' Error. And he had strong arguments to say that cognition cannot function without emotion, that you cannot come to conclusions and decisions if emotion is not involved. And in cognitive linguistics, we study the relation between language and cognition. Well, if cognition is so strongly related to emotion, I thought we have to deal with emotion. It has to play a role in studying language in relation to cognition. Then emotion is closely involved. And also in the middle of the 90s, I was looking for a new subject, so to say. I had been studying particles for quite some years, particles in Dutch and German. Maybe we can talk about it later. But I was open for a new topic. And then I thought, language and emotion is something that attracts me. So let's see what can be done. Yeah.
So as a cognitivist, you realize that there's no such a clear-cut distinction between emotion and reason. That in order to reason, sometimes you use your emotions, or your emotions move you in order to make decisions sometimes, which seem to be rational, but they are not so rational. They are based on your gut feelings.
Yes. And our language use is embedded often in an emotional context. In many genres, emotion plays an important role in narrative, in literature, poetry, persuasion, indeed. But my question, I am primarily a linguist looking at the language system. So in addition to being interested in the role of emotion in human communication, my main question was in how far emotion is coded in the language system, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
That's,
which is interesting for us too, because we are linguists here, and that's what I think it's a fascinating topic for us to do research about. Okay, so what have been your main findings when studying the expressive function of language? What were some revealing things you saw when you started, studying the field?
So yeah, I did a lot of reading. I'm a reader. I like to read, and I also like to read linguistic publications. So I thought I will invest some time in reading what colleagues have been writing about emotion in language, and I encountered more than once, or the harvest was not that big in the sense that linguistics has a strong tradition in studying language that conceptualizes the world. Language is for talking about things in the world, about events in the world, state of affairs, that can be conceptualized in propositions. So that is the main focus of linguistics over centuries. Maybe this has to do with the fact that linguistics has been traditionally based on studying text, and had a link to logic.
Right.
So it's part of the self-image of linguistics, I think, to focus. And I do not deny that language is primarily an instrument to talk about the world, to exchange information about how the world is like, whether it is raining or not. It is important to know. But this instrument is used by human beings with emotions, so we could have a look in how far these emotions find their way into the language, so to say. If we talk about the weather, it's often not in a neutral way. It is important for us, and we have wishes about the weather, and maybe our choice of words, maybe our choice of constructions expresses part of how our attitude to the weather is.
Right.
Yeah.
So then in what ways do you think that the study of emotion, what particular ways the study of emotion can help understand human language?
Yeah, if you want to have a full picture of how human language is structured, which meanings are coded in human language, we have to explore it to the full extent. And my impression was, from reading the linguistic literature, that the emotive part of meaning had not been studied intensively in the past, in the history of linguistics. So I thought some work can be done here, and the more I've been looking at emotive aspects of language, the more I and others discovered that indeed emotion is coded in language. Of course, if you search for something, you find something, and I cannot give a final conclusion about, let's say, the percentage of linguistic. If you look at the whole of one language system, all the words and all the constructions and so on, how much of the meaning of a language can be called expressive meaning, and how much is non-expressive meaning.
Perhaps everything is intertwined.
Yeah, intertwined. But even if it is intertwined, I mean, indeed, a word often has a conceptual part in its meaning and an emotional part. But we could quantify it over the whole language and say, well, maybe in 10 or 20 years we could say that the Spanish language.
Sorry, I need to have it closer. Sorry.
that 10% or 20% of all the meaning that is coded in language X is devoted to expressive meaning, to emotive expressive meaning. I mean, don't you think, if I may also ask you, that it could be an outcome of research in the long term?
Yes, I agree with you. I was also thinking of the relationship between conceptual meaning and procedural meaning within relevance theory.
Yeah.
And I think procedural meaning has a lot to do with emotion and, those implied emotions, and even in sentences that may be used also for information, for giving information, but at the same time you are somehow, implying some emotion attached to it. So
I think
it's a very interesting topic.
Also part of a development in linguistic research, that there's more and more attention to meanings that are not primarily referential. Referential meaning, and in relevance theory, I'm not an expert in relevance theory, but they distinguish between procedural meaning and conceptual meaning. Yes. So this procedural meaning, is a type of meaning that has to do with non-conceptual meaning, and it's a cover term for all kinds of meanings. And this field of studying non-propositional meaning, I locate my interest also in that corner of language research, semantic research.
All right. So then, do you think that emotion should be taken into account when learning foreign languages? It should be just like an obligatory subject within the learning of foreign languages?
I find that not an easy question for me. I mean, I'm primarily a theoretical linguist, and the whole field of applied linguistics and learning foreign languages. There are, of course, experts who will criticize everything I am saying about that. Or if I say something about it, it's only about my gut feeling that, or my personal experience that emotions play a role in different ways in learning a new language. I mean, the whole... your motivation for learning that language, the environment you learn this language in. I mean, if I can...
I did not only refer to this motivational aspect, but also to the fact that you should teach the students the emotional content of words and expressions in the foreign language. Otherwise, if they only learn the dictionary meaning, they may make a lot of mistakes. Or
probably also I did not inspect dictionaries, but probably also indeed in the description of words, that the emotional part of the word meaning or constructional meaning is less strongly represented in the lexicon and in the grammar than should be. So
same as the evaluative meaning.
Indeed,
polarity of
probably in teaching foreign language, the teaching is primarily focused on how to talk about the world, so to say, how to find your way in a city, and how to buy something in a shop, and so this and not primarily in how to express your feelings. So probably, I mean, I'm. It's not my field, but probably foreign language courses could, in the future, pay more attention to this aspect of language.
Right, because they could learn how to check in at a hotel, etc., but also using their emotional intelligence, the emotional knowledge of that language, and knowing rules of politeness that also have to do with emotion, and how you consider your interlocutor, if you take them into account or not, if you're empathetic with your interlocutor.
Yeah.
So I think it's basic to learn a language. In fact, that's my opinion. That's why I was asking you.
But it's also a difficult part of
Yes.
language, right?
Yeah.
So, and probably also difficult
Yes.
to incorporate it in teaching. It's maybe partly you only pick up this aspect of language if you participate in everyday conversation. I mean, what I understood from foreign language teaching, immersion is important.
Yes.
They more and more students are sent to the country where the language is the native language, and
that's how
these
you learn.
interpersonal aspects of language and language use are partly learned in practice, so
Yes.
to say.
Yeah. That's why it's so important, because you learn the language out of context. Then you go to the foreign country and then you put your foot in it
Yeah.
many times because you don't know very well. how to-
Indeed, politeness and emotion and so are often so context bound that it's hard to create situations in the classroom
Right.
where these aspects are present in a natural way.
Yeah.
I mean, you can recreate in a classroom a shop where you can buy all kinds of things. That's easier to simulate, so to say, than to simulate the emotional situations,
emotional situation.
where you need this part of language. Yeah.
Good. So, what was your area of research before getting emotional? Before starting, doing research on emotions, what was?
Yeah,
your-
right. As I said before, in the middle of the 90s, I discovered this field of language and emotion. And before, I have invested most of my research time in studying particles, right? Dutch and German modal particles.
Do you refer to discourse markers?
Discourse mark,
Particles?
but they have more subjective meaning, and indeed they are part of the function words and related to discourse markers, and often the same item can function as a discourse marker and as a modal particle to flavor the subjective tone of the utterance.
Right.
So my dissertation was about one Dutch particle, maar,
I've seen your
M-A-A-R,
examples, yeah.
and it means, but it is the adversative conjunction, but it also means only. So in Dutch, if you say, I have only 5 books, ik heb maar 5 boeken, only 5 books. But it can also be used as a modal particle. So if someone is at the door, I can say, kom maar binnen, please come in, do come in. But it makes it into an admission that sounds friendly.
Positive, yeah.
Yeah. So my main question was how these different functions of one particle, the connective function, the focusing function, so only, and this modal particle function are related, also in diachrony. And maybe, so I had already this interest in these difficult parts of a language, so to say. I always feel attracted to the fuzzy, not easy type of semantics. And maybe that the step to emotion was not that a big step.
No, is it logical?
A logical broadening up to other emotional aspects of language. That's.
All right. So thinking of examples, what was the most unusual instance of emotional language that you ever came across? I mean, which linguistic phenomenon has, called your attention as an instance of emotional language that's curious or...
So with my students, I did quite some research on intensifiers. If you want to say, if you use an adjective like big, you can intensify it by using an intensifier like very, very big. Yeah. But you can use other intensifiers like extremely big or terribly big. And when we started to look at these intensifiers, we came across more and more intensifiers in Dutch and also other languages. And so there are hundreds of intensifiers, in fact. And we were really surprised to discover this, because if you have 1 or 2 or 3 intensifiers, is that not enough? Why does language invest such an energy in providing dozens of intensifiers? Well, the explanation has to be found in emotion. The intensifiers are often emotional intensifiers. You want to not only convey that something is big, but big in such a way that it impressed you and that you were impressed or afraid or amazed or and if you have used an intensifier for some time, if it has been used in the speech community for some time, like terribly big, then it loses its indeed its force. And apparently people, and in particular young people, need new intensifiers, and they use words with a strong negative, typically strong negative meaning, like terrible
or taboo words.
Or taboo words. Apparently these words are very good candidates for developing into new intensifiers. And this was, in several respects, very striking and remarkable, and I was surprised to discover this, that there are so many, that they are typically recruited from negative sources, because negative emotions are strong emotions, so this is not a typical Dutch phenomenon, but apparently, as I learned from the literature, this is a rather maybe universal phenomenon of language. In Chinese and in other languages, you find this phenomenon. So this looking at intensifiers strongly encouraged me to go on for searching emotive phenomena in language. Intensifiers is a good thing to look at, and I had not expected this before, that it was so strongly present and also a factor in language change in the sense of innovation. So in that sense, emotion is also a driving force in language change and innovation to keep on being expressive. And apparently novelty helps to so if you change existing patterns, also if you change word order and so on, then you can be expressive again, and after a certain time you have to do something else again to be
so
expressive.
There's a strong connection between taboo language and emotion. Because since that's a part of language that we cannot disregard, because even though they are dirty words, as they are called or whatever, they are very revealing of people's emotions, and they are used with very specific functions in language, and I think that they are totally connected to emotions. What do you think? Taboo words, swearing.
Taboo words.
Swearing,
but we are supposed not to use taboo words, right?
Well, we're supposed not to, but everyone uses them. What happens if you just nail your finger or something? What do you say?
But I have also observed that people sometimes indeed do not use taboo words for this, or I mean, I consider taboo words as words that you should not use, right? I mean, in conversation, avoiding certain words for diseases. It's also, so certain words are taboo. You better not use them, but because they are connected to the thing itself, to the disease, or to certain things that you don't want. But because if you talk about them, if you use these words that refer to things in the world that are strongly emotional,
but people do use them.
You evoke, apparently, using these words, evoke the emotion. I mean, that's also very intriguing that the word is not only a word referring to this thing or phenomenon, but the emotion that is connected to this thing or phenomenon is also activated in your system, in your body, in your mind. So this shows, in fact, the strong impact that words can have, and so in that sense, it is understandable that people do avoid. I mean, I know people who refer to some other people as he or she, and you know who is meant, but they don't use the name of that person because it evokes too strong emotions. So for those people, these names of people are taboo to use. And this also shows how strong the emotion can be that is associated with the word. I mean, it's associated with the referent, but also with the word. The link of the word with the thing itself and with the emotion is so strong that to leave out the emotion would be a strong reduction of the real of the reality of language as it is connected to the world and to emotion. So taboo words,
well, they exist, and they are emotion-laden words, and so that's why sometimes you avoid them, sometimes you don't. You just say them,
and sometimes you use them on purpose to shock.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So, can we say then that there are languages or cultures that are more emotional than others? Could you say that?
They say so.
So
it is a. I mean, I can talk about as a layman. I'm not an expert on this, but people say that certain people, I mean, communities or countries or nations are strongly emotional. They don't suppress emotion. They accept and it's part of everyday life more than in other cultures.
Do you have any examples?
Well, yeah. I mean, even in my own personal history, I come from a farm, and the whole communication and discourse was strongly oriented to work, and I can't remember that emotion played a strong role in
the farm.
In the human interaction.
It was a discourse system of the farm that you were not supposed to express your emotions there. You were supposed to talk about work.
About work, and maybe it's a very subjective memory, but and what I heard is that, like in Indonesia or Java in particular, people hide their emotions. I mean, of course there are emotions, but they don't play that big a role in public life or in human interaction. You are supposed to smile and to hide your emotions. So.
Although if you're smiling, you're trying to show some kind of emotion, even if you're hiding your inner one.
Yeah, indeed. So in that sense, I really believe that cultures are different, and probably also the language that is connected to that culture in the expression of emotion. I mean, that cultures and maybe also languages, I don't know, differ in the role that, as we experience here in Spain, food, having a good lunch is you take time for having this. I talked with Lachlan that we reserve for lunch maybe half an hour for a quick snack. So how much time and energy you invest in certain aspects of life differs across cultures, and why not for emotion? How important you consider it to that emotion is part of everyday life.
Yes, in fact, for a Spaniard, not sharing his lunch or her lunch with someone would be something, very devoid of emotion. So it's good to share it with someone, not just eat a sandwich. You need to sit down and chat and have a conversation. And that's because they cherish this kind of relationship, which has to do, I think, with emotions and with...
So you're saying this lunch is also part of giving emotion a place, that it gives the opportunity for colleagues to integrate emotions in the everyday professional life.
I remember when I was living in the United States that, many people said, well, in Spain we don't need psychotherapy because we do it on the corridors when we have lunch with our workmates, and whereas here, since you don't talk with your workmates and you don't have lunch with them, so you have to go to psychotherapy. Of course, this is just an anecdote, but, it shows how, different cultures... here you're supposed to tell everyone, how your father is feeling, if he's sick today, or you tell them about, what you feel about what's happening to you. Whereas there it was not so much so.
And then the interesting question for linguists would be whether this cultural difference has an impact on the language. Whether this could mean that a culture where emotion is much more part of everyday interaction takes a bigger part in the linguistic system, so to say, because you use it. Could be. I think that you put such questions on the agenda for future research.
For future research. Right? And so, what about the notion of emotional bilingualism? I refer to the fact that. Do you think? Well, in fact, I think so. I think that you cannot consider yourself totally bilingual until you can express your emotions appropriately in both languages. If you're not emotionally bilingual, then there's something that... Don't you think so?
I think I have to agree if I'm consistent in what I have been saying before, namely if emotion is part of the language system, it is an integrated part, then if you have full competence of this instrument of communication, and if you do not have command of this emotive aspect, then you don't then you are not competent in the language to the full. So it's a logical consequence of the claim that emotional meaning is part of linguistic meaning.
Yeah, because you may feel the same, of course, whether you speak one language or the other, but you have to know how to express it differently. You know, which is the case.
So you have to learn the connotations and the emotional value of words and constructions to be fully competent also on this aspect of language. But if I may, there's another aspect to language and emotion and different languages. I mean, you can feel at home with a certain language. I mean that you love a certain language. Typically, it is your mother tongue. But if you have learned a language in a pleasant context and you started to love that language,
emotionally,
and every time you use that language, you feel happy, or you it contributes.
True.
This
is related to my next question, because I was going to ask you, I know that you speak German, Dutch and English, and I don't know if you speak French or other languages, but
I speak Dutch and German and English to a certain extent.
Well.
For technical, I consider English as an instrumental language, but I never have a natural feeling of being able to express myself.
Okay, so my
English.
question was going to be then, what is your emotional experience with these languages? So do you think that you speak better German than English because you are more emotionally attached to it?
I said before, I come from a farm, and we spoke a really deep dialect. Dutch dialect, but even if you had learned Dutch very well, you would not understand our conversation at home. So when I went to school, I had to learn Dutch in a rather difficult way. I mean, I had my problems learning Dutch, and maybe this made me aware of the whole language problem, and maybe this had an influence on my decision to study languages later on. And this feeling of uneasiness with Dutch, I think it stayed with me. And then I had the opportunity to study for 1 year in Germany. And I lived with a family part of that year. And I was really integrated in this family. And I learned German there. In addition to my school German, in a very pleasant, natural way. And all the time when I speak German, this gives me a happy feeling that is similar to my native language, which is not Dutch. I consider my dialect as my native language. So in my perception of my own, German and my dialect are my emotional languages, and Dutch and English are more instrumental.
That's curious. I never have thought of that, you know.
So and
what's the name?
Maybe this played a role when my partner is from Germany. I mean, the fact when I met her at a conference, the fact that she was a native speaker of German contributed to her.
So you're falling in love with her.
Absolutely, it was part of
your emotions,
a bigger picture. But to be able to talk with her in German, contributed to my happiness with her.
Right. Yes. No, I totally understand, because I have similar feelings with different languages. Yeah. Okay. So. Then what would be the lines for future research in the area? What would you suggest that we should do here in this group? You're the expert, so what still has to be, research, and there's lots that has to be done, but what would you recommend us?
So what I understood from your research is that you are looking at emotional language in different genres and discourse,
but everything having to do with the workplace.
With the workplace,
yes.
Yeah. So I think that's very interesting to explore different contexts of language use and to compare them in the role of emotive language in different contexts of language use in the workplace, in the family, in all kinds of situations. I mean, there is a lot to do, but also purely descriptively looking at the language system, there are still parts of the language system, I think, that are underexplored. Such as a precise inventory and description of the interjections, the intensifiers, the modal particles, the emotional value of all kinds of intonation patterns.
It's a tough one.
In the I mean, our languages like Spanish and Dutch have been described already rather good, but there are many languages in the world, and probably there are new kinds of constructions to be discovered where other emotions are part of the grammar. Like I've given examples before in my lecture, like fear and so I think in the coming years, emotive linguistics, is a field.
I think it's a trendy topic.
A trendy topic,
nowadays,
right? Put your money in this
emotions.
in emotions.
So the last question was, what would you recommend our students who are watching us, and or any researcher who's interested in the topic of language and emotion? Would you, I mean, not about lines of future research, but what would you tell them?
Explore a very exotic language that has not been described yet, and describe it, and also don't forget the emotional part of it. But also there are situations of language use where maybe emotional language is strongly present. I mean, we have corpora, but I think the corpora we have are still rather unemotional corpora. They are collected in, I mean, maybe they are collected in families, but in maybe at the dinner table, that is already rather close to people's private situation, but there are even more private situations. I mean, would be great to have a corpus of bedroom talk or pillow talk.
That's an interesting topic. We have a student here who's sitting at the back, and she's studying reproach. Reproach as a speech act. And she says it's difficult. That's why she's using movies, because she cannot get into the bedroom of a couple to see how they are, arguing and reproaching each other. That's difficult. But it would be nice if we could get that information.
If we could get make a corpus of language use in emotional situations, around death, around birth, in the bedroom, and so on. That would really be fantastic. I would put my money on someone who has the access to this kind of these situations of language use, and maybe we would find words and constructions that are under-perceived by linguists.
No, and one thing that I think would be useful to do for emotion is also not just transcriptions, but also having videotaped, situations,
very important
so that you can see
thing.
gesture,
the whole,
expression, bodily movements, everything that accompanies.
So the future is also in multimodal communication. Multimodal communication.
Yes.
Linguists will have to integrate themselves in multimodal communication research. All these people who are doing gesture research. We can profit from them, and the near future. I see that the exciting times of research are still ahead of us.
All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Foulen, for this interview, for your kindness, for being here, for having accepted our invitation. And now we're going to open, just a few minutes for questions, if anyone here has questions. We have who can... All right, Carmen.
Thanks a lot for the interesting interview. My question is, are there any regressions of forms which have been substituted for euphemisms when these get lexicalized, do they come back, and with what impact, if they come back at all? For example, a form which gets lost, because it's found rude or taboo, or and then a euphemism takes over. Is there any case where the original form comes back?
I see. I don't know examples where the original form comes back. What I understand from the literature is that the poor euphemism that is replacing the old form also falls victim of the same emotional impact, and after a while it has to be replaced again. So it's cyclical. Again cyclical in the sense that if the topic or the thing that this word refers to stays emotional, then euphemism only helps for some time, and then becomes emotional itself and has to be replaced again. But maybe there are examples where people can return to an original form because it is experienced as new and has not this emotional
mitigation anymore, right?
Right.
Strength. Okay.
Could be interesting topic of research. Patterns of euphemism
Cyclical, yes.
across time and cultures and so on. And what is taken as a euphemism? A one letter as a euphemism, for example.
Well, I can think.
Or another word from another domain. So the patterns in the choice of euphemism, I've never thought about it, but your question is, in fact...
like terms like, for example, black, and then color.
African American.
Yeah.
And
then...
But sometimes I think they coexist. Because you say, oh, she passed away, instead of saying she died. But then sometimes people use died depending on the context. And I think there are different cases. Some of them, as you say, well, that's my impression. That sometimes, yes, the euphemism takes over, and then the taboo, let's say, word is never used again. But some of the times they coexist.
True.
But he's the one being interviewed. So.
No, but I've never studied euphemism in particular. So, but now that you ask, my main question would be which word, which expression is recruited to be used as the euphemism? Where is it taken from which domain? Because you want to replace the old word, but where are you going to find the new one? Are there neutral domains where you can take something, and can we discover patterns in the creative solution of this problem of replacement? How do people and languages do this?
Sometimes they are metaphors. They use a metaphor as a euphemism.
And
you have studied metaphor a lot.
But a systematic study of all these movements that are made to create a replacing word, like metaphor, but maybe other operations. So.
And sometimes at the cost of accuracy. For example, murió de una larga y penosa enfermedad, cancer or whatever.
The microphone.
He died or she died of a long and terrible disease, or but you're being inaccurate. You're being more vague. It can be anything, which is hard.
Okay. Any other questions? Lachlan. Bye.
Thanks very much for the interview. I was wondering about the subjunctive mood in Indo-European languages. Just in very general terms, in English and in the Celtic languages, in other words, the languages spoken in the United Kingdom, it's pretty well disappeared. In the German language, it's used to mean that the speaker is standing back from what is said and is attributing the words to somebody else. Okay, so the subjunctive has to do with a sort of a lack of involvement. It's a sort of don't blame me kind of mood. It was somebody else who said it. But in the Romance languages, it tends to be associated with emotions. Okay, so if you hope that something will happen, or you fear that something will happen, the embedded clause is always put in the subjunctive. Okay, so that there's a clear connection for me, or my feelings, and between using the subjunctive and expressing an emotion in the Romance languages, like Spanish and Portuguese and French and so on.
Yeah.
So I have no idea, but historically speaking, it's the same sort of distinction between indicative and subjunctive mood. But you know, if you're looking at for grammatical phenomena, that was one that is a possibility.
Thanks. We put this one on the list, so to say, that subjunctive is a good candidate for developing into a means for expressing emotions, and it would be fantastic if we could even link it to culture. We were talking about culture. Apparently, the Germanic languages decided to not use it in the emotive direction, but to let fade it out, so to say. Or in German, they kept it for this distancing. So it went in the other way, indeed, as you suggest. I didn't think about this. It's fantastic.
Okay. No more questions? Okay, so thank you very much again. Thank you. Indeed, it's been a very interesting, I think, interview, and I hope that all your insights, the insights that you've given us, are also useful for all the people and students that are watching us now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara, for this. For my first interview experience in my life, and it was a very pleasant experience.
Well, so I hope that they have positive emotions around it. Okay.